Molfese, Ph.D. is an internationally recognized expert who has published over 160 books and articles on the emerging relationships between brain development, language, and cognitive processes from infancy into adulthood. He is the director of the Center for Brain, Biology, and Behavior at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the director of the Big Ten Ivy League Interconference Traumatic Brain Injury Research Collaboration, a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Sports-Related Concussions in Youth, and editor-in-chief for the International Scientific Journal Developmental Neuropsychology. His work has been continuously funded since 1975 through grants from NIH, NSF, and other public and private agencies. Please welcome Dr. Molfese.
We're going to try and switch out mics here, or maybe we don't need to. Yeah, this one, I'm sure, okay. Great, thanks very much, appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. I've chaired two different departments as part of my professional life, one on medical department, the other department of psychology. And frankly, I've always said the department's only as strong as its staff. So I'm greatly appreciative of all the efforts that you do on the part of the college and the university. It's quite clear we couldn't do a fraction of what we do without your input. So thank you. So I'm going to dive into this brief talk on the Center for Brain Biology and Behavior. You've all seen the construction going on the east side of the football stadiums. We know all important things revolve around the football stadium area. Besides being the third most populous town on a game weekend in the state of Nebraska, it also hosts the Supercomputing Center, which is ranked one of the top 500 in the world, and also will play host to this Center for Brain Biology and Behavior on the south side of that East Edition. And on the north side, they'll have a installation that's the Human Performance Laboratory. That'll be an athletic research facility. Let's see if this plays here.
Former Nebraska football player Brandon Rigoni has had at least one concussion.
Yeah, I was out cold. Good, that's one good one higher.
Rigoni is now a Husker strength coach and a research assistant on a project to learn more about a troubling condition.
Concussion is a serious issue for athletes because of the long-term effects that we don't fully understand.
Knowledge about concussions will expand thanks to a partnership between Nebraska Athletics and University of Nebraska-Lincoln Research. UNL psychologist Dennis Molfese records images of the brain during certain activities to determine how different areas behave before and after a concussion.
What we're trying to do is get information on the athletes, their cognitive processing, their skills prior to any incident, and then we'll be able to see what's the actual loss of skills, how long does it take them to regain those skills, and perhaps how better to formulate interventions that will be more effective.
Molfese also heads a Big Ten research collaboration on traumatic brain injury. It's estimated that a college football team will see about 20 significant concussions annually. For the Big Ten, that's roughly 240 concussions each year.
So a big part of what we're trying to do in the Big Ten in terms of our concussion consortium is to identify what may be the risks and how best to help the students and the coaches understand what those risks are and to mitigate or reduce or even eliminate them.
To the extent that we can contribute something meaningful that can help someone out in their day-to-day life as they age and that sort of thing, that makes sense to do.
Research at Nebraska could take some of the risk out of the game.
Basically, what I'm talking about there is using brain imaging as one way to try and look at concussion in sports. There's, all of you have heard of course, through the NFL, college sports, a number of individuals who get injured each year. There's 1.7 million official concussions in the United States each year. We really think the number is closer to 10 million. And football, of course, has gotten a lot of attention for the concussions. that occur in this game. But there are other sports, college sports, that are also certainly at risk. What makes Nebraska unique is we have this very direct collaboration between the athletics program and the academic side, which is truly unique. We don't see this kind of collaboration going on in any other campus, university across the United States, if not the rest of the world. And in fact, this collaboration has given rise to a Big Ten initiative on concussion, and now most recently a collaboration between the Big Ten and the Ivy League conferences, all geared at looking at concussion. So across the two leagues, we'll be studying essentially about 17,000 athletes, which will be the largest undertaking to look at athletic development and certainly the issue of concussion in college athletics. The expansion, as I mentioned, is on the east side of the stadium. Will be occupying 3 floors at the lower portion of the building, and the Human Performance Laboratory for athletics will be on the other side. We'll be having an open house there. Right now the building is about a month and a half ahead of schedule, so we think our move-in date's somewhere around mid-June, but I would suspect by the time the dust settles and we get rid of all the dust weevils and so on, it'll be more like August by the time we have an opportunity for a real open house. The facility that in the center, we have approximately, will amount to about 26,000 square feet of research space, comprising 46 research rooms, a relatively small number. We have about 12 offices in the whole building. Most of the faculty researchers will be in what I call a bullpen configuration, basically open rooms about half the size each, that will be occupied by about 40 scientists, graduate students, undergraduates, who hopefully will be talking to each other and collaborating in a very open type environment. On the very first floor, one of the jewels of the building is something called the fMRI, Functional Magnetic Resonant Imaging. And it's a state-of-the-art piece of equipment that allows you to take very precise pictures of the brain without having to do any surgery. It's basically a big magnet that picks up on the movement of magnetic elements within the brain, and we can make pictures of all of that. And it also allows us to track blood flow in the brain and almost anything that has an electrical charge to it. It's a small device, weighs about 20,000 pounds. It's about the size of 2 of these tables. And if you have a semi on one side of the room and the fMRI on the other, the fMRI, or the semi is going to come flying towards the fMRI. It's a very powerful magnet. Surrounding this, by the way, outside of our radiological suite, are going to be hot dog vendors and so on. Something like that. This is shielded, so you won't be exposed to any radiation. But if you notice the hamburgers quivering, you might move further away. On the second floor, we'll have, again, a few offices, a number of supercomputing laboratories will be on each floor, and then all the rest of the space is really laboratory space. And here's this open area where we expect this research commons where most of our scientists are going to be. The idea of the open commons is to get people to talk to each other, God forbid. So with this group, we have anthropologists, sociologists, musicians, people working in textiles, different areas of education, psychology. So it really is meant to be a very great mix of disciplines. There are lots of these kinds of brain imaging centers around the world. Harvard has about 50 of these magnets that we have one of. But what will make us very special is that we're going to do a different type of training. Usually these brain imaging centers have a lot of neuroscientists, MDs, who their specialties are really how to study the brain. But they actually tend to know not as much about how to study behavior. And the difference we're doing here is we're going to work with a lot of your faculty who have lots of publications and grants and so on, who actually are specialists and are well known in behavioral circles. We're just going to train them how to use the brain imaging techniques. And we think that'll give us a very unique approach to the study of brain-behavior relationships. It's not really shared by any other imaging centers around the world. At least that's our game plan. We'll have everything glass. The few offices we do have, we have glass walls and glass doors, so nobody can hide. It really does pull people out to interact in glass-sided stairways, which I found touring the building a couple of days ago was a little risky because you may not be always watching your steps, which could be hazardous, another way to get a concussion. Although I guess if we need subjects, maybe we can the IRB, I don't think, would appreciate that. So on the second floor, again, we've got a small number of offices, computing area, again, the research commons, and again, all the rest are laboratories. And I'll describe briefly in a moment what kinds of facilities we have. What we've done here is we've developed a model for training. And since I've been here, I came in October of 2010, I've trained over 230 faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates on how to do some types of brain imaging. And some of those people now have submitted research grants. We have a number of people, about 40 people are involved in different kinds of research involving brain imaging that simply didn't happen before we did that training. But this is the sort of the way we go about our training, starting off with a workshop and helping people design studies, doing pretty extensive training on how to actually do the imaging itself, how to analyze the data, and ultimately to try and get journal articles and grants out the door so that we can begin to build a significant reputation for UNL in this area of brain imaging and behavior. And the goal is, I always think you need to set good goals. So what we want to do is basically take over the world. So I didn't wear my appropriate tie, my pinky in the brain tie, which I should have. These are the technologies we'll have, and in some respects we are very unique. I mentioned the functional magnetic resonant imaging. A number of hospitals in the area have these kinds of machines, but none of them have the functional component. Functional component allows us to not only make pictures of the brain, but actually to identify what actions or activities those different brain areas are involved in. The hospitals are mainly interested in seeing, is this area damaged? Is there a tumor in that area, or is there a bleed, some blood where there shouldn't be blood? But we're going to be looking at much more detail. We have, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment, EEG nets, nets for recording brain electrical activity that have lots of electrodes built into them. This one is 256, and we use those in testing babies and as well as adults and children. We have what's called near-infrared technology, light photons, little light energy components penetrate the skull, and they hit the blood, and they bounce back. It's sort of a poor man's fMRI, if you will, but allows us to also track blood flow in the brain. And that can give us some ideas about brain functions, even in very small infants. So one of my NIH grants is to develop this kind of technology for use with newborn infants, and we're into a phase, second phase, concluding phase of that research now. But that'll be a very new technology, and we'll be the only ones in the world that will have that technology. We have transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is a technology that's been developed in recent years. It's being used by a number of colleagues to work with autistic children. There's some theories about why a child is autistic, that there may be some asynchrony, some lack of communication, or one area of the brain interfering with another area of the brain, processing information. So we'll have that piece of equipment to study that kind of intervention and see just how well does it work. Have a number of behavioral science labs, behavioral studies, political science laboratories, and so on, where the focus is really on interviewing people, giving them behavioral tests, seeing how they respond. We'll have several balance labs, vestibular labs. Balance is one of those things that's affected by concussion. If you have a concussion, you're not as steady on your feet, you may tend to move around. You may have difficulty in identifying when a line is level that is parallel to the ground. And so that's what that lab is used for. Again, we'll have a couple of those. Several large computer laboratories, a number of developmental laboratories. My wife, Victoria Molfese, who always describes herself when she comes in to do a guest lecture in my developmental classes, is the real Dr. Molfese. She has an NIH grant, and it's looking at temperament in 2-year-olds and sleep. And so those of you that have been parents, you know, if your little toddler is a little cranky, they're not getting enough sleep, they're probably not going to be as the sweet angel that they might otherwise be. Some of us, like me, never attain that status, but that's something else. We will have an endocrine lab, so we'll be able to take blood samples, saliva samples, and look for traces that might indicate a concussion is occurring. I have a grant in the collaboration with a colleague at Johns Hopkins University, Doug Granger, who we're working on that project. We'll have a number of eye tracking laboratories, both for use with newborn and very young infants, as well as with adults. 2-persons genetics lab, political science laboratory. One of the unique things we'll be able to do is to record eye movements at the same time we're conducting the fMRI and recording the high-density EEG from a single individual. No other laboratory in the world has that capability, so it'll be completely unique to Nebraska and to the Center for Brain Biology and Behavior. Part of what we see here is this unique collaboration, of course, between athletics and academics as we focus on the issue of concussion. Concussion basically is simply brain damage. It tends to be what we think is a milder form of brain damage, but we really do not know whether a person actually does ever really recover from a concussion. Do they get to be back the way they were before they had the concussion? Physicians now assume that's the case, but in fact there's actually no data to support that. Something that a lot of us are working on. This is some of the equipment that we, of course, will be using. This is a functional magnetic resonant imaging system. It's basically got a big tunnel at the top end where you have this big magnetic field that allows us to look at the brain structures. We got the largest bore we could at 70 centimeters in diameter. Football players, on the other hand, especially the linemen, I've discovered are a lot larger than that. So I've talked with colleagues around the world of how do you get a very large lineman into a 70 centimeter magnet, and the consensus was universal: you push. So we'll be working on that. We'll probably have to get some other linemen to help us push. The fMRI gives you these very detailed pictures of brain structure, but it also gives us information about blood flow. As you use an area of your brain, you use up the oxygen and nutrients in that brain area, and the brain has this incredible system that as you use up those nutrients, it begins to pump more blood into that particular area. And so by tracking the blood flow, we can get some idea of what brain area you're using. So let's say you close your eyes right now and you're thinking of what your household is going to look like as soon as you walk through the door after work today. Hoping not to bring up any bad visions. But one of the things that happens is your occipital lobe becomes much more active as you're making that image, in your brain, so there's increased blood flow then to replace those nutrients. And these spots here indicate increased blood flow. In this case, that's the difference between children at risk for developing dyslexia versus children not at risk for developing dyslexia. And oftentimes what we find is more blood flow on the right hemisphere. There's more right hemisphere activation for kids who are dyslexic when they're trying to read than we would see in a normal reader, a child who's a successful reader. We also have the capability of looking at what's called DTI, diffuser tensor imaging. And what this is these are white matter tracks in the brain. Most of your brain actually is white matter. It's basically pathways that move information from one brain area to the next. And we think that's the area that's really most disrupted during concussions, because what happens with those pathways is that they get stretched. The whiplash that comes from a concussion torques the white matter in ways it's not meant to go, and that can cause it to die back, and make it much more difficult for different brain areas to communicate. Diffusion tensor imaging, this is just a color map from looking at the top of the head, these different pathways in the brain. And these different colors indicate different ways in which information is moving while this person was involved in a particular task. So each of these colors, again, represents a different direction. That's a side view of the white matter tracts in your brain. So you have lots and lots of these. Basically, cables communicating between different brain areas. It is a magnetic resonant imaging system, so again, it can track any sort of magnetic element in the brain, and it can track its movement as it moves through the brain. So this is magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which basically means that if you have something like sodium molecules, any type of molecule with a charge in it, water is one of those, H2O, you can find where it's located in the brain and then watch it move over time. The Balance Laboratory, Julie Honecker, Sherry Jones from Communication Disorders will be running that part of the center. And this is an example of some of the different tasks: walking a straight line, having the person make judgments about whether the line is horizontal to the earth or not. Near-infrared spectroscopy, this is where the light penetrates the skull, bounces off the blood, and can be picked up by these other receptors that are around the head. Those allow us to isolate where in the brain there is increased blood flow. In a newborn infant, we actually developed this technology with a company in Oregon, EGI Incorporated. This is one of our test subjects at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Newborn infant, a few hours old, went into newborn nursery, asked for volunteers. The baby raised their hands. Parents said, yes, okay. What we're doing here is presenting sounds and trying to track the blood flow in the brain, and also record the brain activity, the electrical activity at the same time, to get some idea of how changes in processing relate to blood flow and this electrical activity. My wife and I actually discovered in the mid-'80s a technique for identifying babies at birth at risk for developing dyslexia, and so one of our projects is trying to look at interventions that we can begin to start in infancy. And in fact, right after this, I head to Omaha with another group from the med school there to talk about implementing that particular project there. This is this transcranial magnetic stimulation system. Basically, it's a wand that has a big electrical field, and as you move it close to one area of the brain, it interferes with the normal brain processing, and so it can suppress that area of brain processing for brief periods of time. One of my students, Amy Papanikolaou, actually is my first PhD student, actually developed the technology at the University of Texas Med School a few decades ago, and so that continues to be something that offers some promise for work with autism. Eye trackers will be able to look at what you look at. There's a machine that uses infrared sensors to pick up on how you scan a picture, the order in which you code that information, and we'll be mapping it onto our brain recordings as well as blood flow with the fMRI system. We have this Big Ten Ivy League collaboration, as I mentioned. It's a collaboration right now of 22 universities. There are two more joining us, Maryland and quote a famous debate. Pardon? Rutgers? Yeah, thank you. So that'll bring us to 24. We're waiting on June, I guess, when the conference has finalized that, but then we'll have a few more. But what's unique about this particular proposal and project is that we're going to test players prior to the start of this season, so that if unfortunately somebody is injured, we'll know what their baseline behavior is, and we can know then just how much ability they lost and in what domain, and then we'll be able to see whether they actually get back to where they were originally. And we'll be involving coaches and trainers, medical personnel, and a variety of different disciplines in this research. Another thing that's very unique about it is we're developing a shared database between the Big Ten and the Ivy League, between all the universities. We'll be moving very, very large data sets. A single subject will generate 20 terabytes of information, brain information. That's a lot of information. I think you can get, 1,000 Old or New Testament Bibles, just as a point of reference, into a few megabytes of storage. So terabytes are millions of megabytes of data. And then, of course, what we're after is to pursue external funding and secure funds from National Institutes of Health and other agencies. And I've already met with a number of the program officers at different branches. We hope to get out our first grant application this summer that'll involve a subset of our laboratories. The whole thrust of all this, of course, is to inform medical and behavioral sciences to come up with ways to make different kinds of sporting activities safer, and also perhaps to facilitate training, accelerate training, and make our athletes more competitive, at the same time having the training procedures be safer. We're also looking very much at interventions. There's a lot of effort that's been spent on, somebody's got a concussion, what do you usually do? You leave them alone. But in fact, there's some data now coming out that suggests the last thing you want to do is leave somebody who has a concussion alone. Unfortunately, with things like shaken baby syndrome, you're probably familiar with that, where somebody is lost it and they shake a baby rapidly for even a few seconds. And what that does is it almost always pretty severely damages the occipital lobe, but also stretches those white matter fibers in the brain that tear away their ability to communicate between different brain areas. But right now, the standard operating procedure is simply leave the babies alone, and if they recover, that's great. If they don't, unfortunately, that's what happens. But we think we really need to take a much, much more active role in this, and so we've been designing intervention techniques, again, some of which we'll start working with hopefully soon with Madonna Rehab. And then, of course, looking at other innovations that may come about through all of this. So we're going to generate really unprecedented information throughout this whole center of brain biology and behavior. I'm putting a bit of an emphasis on the concussion because that's one of the areas where we're really at the forefront right now. And as I mentioned, looking at athletes before and after and during the season as well, doing pretty extensive testing. If somebody's injured, test them, but also test somebody else who isn't injured, who plays a same position, so we'll have appropriate controls. Nobody really knows what the results are of multiple impacts, multiple concussions, and so that's another thing we hope to track and get more information on, and then share the database across the conferences, develop interventions, certainly improve equipment design, and we're also working in developing better concussion awareness programs, which will have a lot of implications, not just here at UNL in terms of athletics, but we plan to have an impact really across the state and work with other athletic programs at the grade school and high school level, but also in terms of how it impacts car accidents and so on. Just to give you a brief show on the impact. This is a sequence of pictures going from point of impact at 0 milliseconds, 15 milliseconds, 15 thousandths of a second after impact. Let's say a quarterback being tackled from the side. And this is at 25 milliseconds, 25 thousandth of a second. So that's thousands. It takes you 200 milliseconds to blink your eyes. So this is way shorter than that. Anyhow, there's a big fissure that separates the left side of the brain from the right side of the brain. This would be the front of the head, the back of the head. 15 milliseconds after you're impacted, the brain has different weights at different parts of it, and so those brain areas move at different rates. And what this does is it disrupts the connection between the two sides of the brain. Those may or may not be damaged to the point where they lose communication. And at 25 milliseconds, it's not quite as severe. It's beginning to recover a bit. But there are other tissues now that are no longer in alignment. So really fast hit that could be on the order of 200 to 300 G's, 200 to 300 times the force of gravity. It's very short, but still it's very, very intense. And the brain actually is, we think, is suffering damage even when you go to 25 Gs or 10 Gs. So this is 10 times that in terms of, let's say, a football tackle. Or you're stopping rapidly in your car because of a car accident. So our future goals, we want to look at identifying distortions produced by brain injury, developing interventions to return people to more normal processing more rapidly, and then have individuals, even with severe injuries, be able to interact with the world in a much more normal fashion. So that's one of the goals, at least as it concerns concussion. So overall, we've got a pretty ambitious project, a very unique facility going in, and very unique opportunities with the kinds of equipment we have, and certainly in terms of what we hope to do in terms of training really across disciplines. So you all represent different departments, and my hope is we're going to have faculty from your different departments actually involved in this sort of grand collaboration. So, thank you. Any questions? Yes?
Are you going to look at stroke patients and how a stroke affects the brain?
Yeah, that's not connected with concussion, but one of my advantages of being ADHD is I have lots of broad interests. So, we look at concussion. We'll be looking at things like language acquisition. My wife and I actually run a national laboratory for reading disabilities, so we'll be working on that as well. So yes, very definitely.
Do you follow any of these athletes or other concussion victims longitudinally, so you see what happens to them? That's exactly what we plan to do, and track them over seasons as well. So once they agree to participate, we'll continue to work with them as long as they'll allow us.
Will you start with athletes ever at a younger age where they may already be impacted by concussions, say middle school, high school?
Absolutely, and we don't know. Typically when the athletes are brought in here at UNL, as I understand, they're certainly asked about prior concussions, but almost never do they actually get documentation of that. And frankly, I used to teach in a med school. There's really a limited amount of time you have for working with the med students, and concussion has never been a high priority in terms of broad education. And there's no national program, training program certification for physicians on training them in concussion. That's one of the issues we're looking at in terms of National Academy of Sciences. Yes, very definitely they could have and likely do have. Big question is, the teams on average, the Big Ten report, and this applies to any league, roughly about 20 official concussions per season with a team squad that maybe is 150 players or so. But that's official concussions, and frankly I talked to my colleagues at other universities, the physicians, the teams and so on, many of whom are leading their research efforts, and they're sure they're missing cases. Also, the athletes often don't want to tell you that they've had an injury because they don't want to lose playing time. But that's the scary part, because if they do have a concussion, the last thing you want to do is put them in a situation where they're going to be at risk for getting another concussion and compounding it. That's just a really grave risk, we think. So that's another issue. I can see us in a few years as we get some grants going and beginning to work with grade school children in junior high and high school. Right now there's some high schools I found in the area where some of the high school kids think getting a concussion is a point of macho-ness, which is really stupid and quite dangerous. Again, a concussion is brain damage. There's no question. Yes?
How effective is wearing a helmet to keep you from getting concussions?
You guys ask great questions. Everybody agrees at this point that concussions don't work, but they're so much better than the old leather concussions, which used to produce skull fractures, which were even worse, because you get a fracture, then you get some really serious, moderate to severe brain damage. So people are always looking at how to redesign concussions. There's one firm I'm aware of that's been looking at mountain goats with the big long horn rams and so on. It sounds sort of curious, but it turns out that if you look at their skulls have the bone, but then they got a bunch of cushioning material, then they got more bone and more cushioning. material. So a number of helmet companies are beginning to look at that as a way to reduce the shock. But if you have a big bar on your helmet and you hit the ground, that bar digs in, and so that torques, makes whiplash for the brain, and that can put you at risk for shearing. So it's a lot better than nothing. And the designs now are much better than they used to be. Some good data on that. But the bottom line from all the lectures I've been going through this academic science thing is that there's still a lot they don't know about helmets, and they're still looking for the perfect design. So it's a unfinished science, to say the least. Yes?
So how do you get your subjects that you know?
Kidnapping does not work. You ask volunteers. Most of the really successful schools have a program where the concussion screening is done at the beginning of the season. It's just done as part of the regular intake of athletes, and they go through all the other medical screening. And then should an athlete have a concussion, then they go through the standard protocol plus the research as well. We found here, we weren't doing that this last year, and we found that roughly about a quarter of the football players volunteered to participate. And of those, so that's about 40. And of those, we finished doing a retest at the end of the season with only 13 players. And only one concussion, one person who experienced a concussion allowed us to test them once, but wouldn't allow us to test them repeatedly. So with that kind of testing, you really can't get much information. And that's why schools like Penn State, Michigan State have all moved to this, where they just incorporate it as part of the regular screening protocol. The students still have the option to opt out, so they have the freedom to choose to participate in the research or not. But the best guesses are that we're using tests that are largely seen as being really relevant to concussion and evaluation, so that then becomes the property of the medical team, that then scientists like me can say, well, this is the kind of information this is going to give you, this might be relevant, this may not, sort of thing. But until you have really universal buy-in, you're really going to get very little information. That's been our problem in the past. Schools that have gotten the whole team to participate generate really big breakthroughs. So we know that, and there's discussion about doing away with kickoff returns, because we know that's a high concussion risk situation. Changing the kickoff line, making it so the ball's more likely to go into the end zone and not be run back, as Tom Osborne tells them, is a much better strategy for reducing concussions. And even if the players are running back, they have less field, so there's a chance for less injury. Yes?
Do you find a lot of pushback from athletics? I mean, are people worried about what you're going to find out in terms of band? Like I've heard, in some of the NFL, they don't want to know, kind of, like if I don't know, it doesn't hurt you.
I certainly have run into that. I've not run into that here at Nebraska. I've been really impressed with Bo, for example, sitting down and talking with him, and he's really gotten into it. He was talking to us and making suggestions about, I really think this is the kind of training we do that puts players more at risk. I think we will look at that to work. If you want our game films, you've got them. If you want our practice films, you've got them. I have yet to meet a coach who wasn't really concerned about the players. So I think that really says a lot about the coaches. At the same time, I've certainly heard coaches across the leagues talk about, they worry about the sport disappearing. And my rejoinder to that usually is, we know that already is a risk, so we know that if we don't do anything, you're going to have, in college, for example, kids come in and they have ACT scores of the top 33, 36, which is the top. And if they get some severe concussions, especially multiple, they're going to struggle in their classes, and they're going to leave with an ACT equivalent of 10 or 8, which never would have gotten them into college to begin with. And that's an extreme case, but that is the kind of danger that one is concerned about. And I think the coaches are, because these are student athletes, these are people who have their whole life in it. So last thing you want to do in an educational environment is take away opportunities. So I think in terms of athletics, they've been certainly here at UNL, and again, coaches I've talked about elsewhere, and trainers. Trainers are great. They're very much in favor of this kind of testing. After that is working out the mechanics, because the testing takes time, and players' time between academics and athletics is really pretty programmed. So it's trying to find little niches where you can get people in to test. Other questions? Yes?
What are you finding the high schools are doing, like in Lincoln, and my son played football, and they do concussion testing? Is that effective, what they're doing? I know they've changed it over the course of time. He's in college now, but is that making a parent feel good that they're doing that they can go back and do that baseline, or is it just not even enough?
It probably depends on what tests they're using to establish baseline. Some of the basic tests, like the SCAT2 and the impact, there's questions about how really good they are, how sensitive they are. They're computer-based type of tests that you could give on an iPad, or it could be a paper and pencil type of test. In general, across the country, you have most of your medical resources, trainers with really good training at the college level. You move to the high school level, you have very little training in general. Trainers are poorly trained. I mean, I was a high school trainer when I was in high school. What did I know? I was doing well to be able to open and shut doors. You move to grade school, and accordingly. And also, we're moving to have better provisions for training of coaches and athletic trainers at all levels. But I think nationwide, we just have a lot to work on. Keep in mind, in the United States, we have 4.1 million children born each year. We have 10 million head injuries each year. So we have a head injury rate twice the birth, 2.5 times the birth rate. In my way of thinking, head injury is the #1 health concern. And we have lots of health concerns, but the incidence for head injury is much, much higher. And the loss of productivity due to serious head injuries is astronomical. So thank you all very much. Oh,
I was just wondering, are you looking at just football or other sports as well?
We're actually working with the women's soccer team. Until we can get some grants, we're limited in terms of what we can do. But eventually, we hope to do many more sports. But we like to really have a balance between men and women. Women are at much more risk for serious injury from concussion, and you ladies will like this. Men have a heavier head, so we need a stronger neck. Women have lighter heads, so they don't have to have as strong muscles. But then in terms of the same force, it's going to have more of a negative effect on the woman than the male. So you get out of it knowing that you're more at risk for more damage, but you do still get to say that you don't have a fat as head as a male. So thank you all very much.